If you've been following this series, you already know we haven't been treating anxiety, rumination, or overthinking as problems with the content of your thoughts. We've been looking instead at something more specific, how your attention is being controlled in real time, and how that control determines what your mind keeps returning to against your wishes. In this video, I want to slow this down and isolate a single transition point in that process. Because in cognitive terms, that's where the entire pattern reorganizes. This is the point where your attention stops behaving like it normally does and starts reorganizing itself around your internal experience instead of the external task. So let's start there. You're doing something simple, right? Reading, working, focusing, and a thought or a sensation appears. That part is normal. From a cognitive perspective, this is called bottom-up information entering your awareness. Nothing unusual is happening yet. But what matters is what your attention does next. Because your attention doesn't just register it and move on. It engages it. It holds it long enough to evaluate it. And this is the first critical shift. Now, at this point, cognitive psychology would describe what's happening as a move into self-referential processing. That means your attention is no longer just directed at the task. It starts turning inward and evaluating your internal state. So instead of continuing with what you were doing, your system shifts now into monitoring. You start checking what the thought means, whether it matters, whether something is wrong, should you do something about it? And that shift is the key transition. Because now your executive control is no longer just selecting task-relevant information. It begins prioritizing your internal evaluation, and that immediately changes what gets selected. Things that would normally pass through your awareness, thoughts, sensations, your feelings, they're no longer ignored. They're now treated as relevant signals, so they get pulled into your working memory. And once something enters your working memory like this, it stays active. It's held, maintained, and repeatedly reaccessed. That alone changes the dynamics of attention, because now your attention keeps returning to the same material. Not because something new is happening, but because the system is now treating it as important. So that's the first mechanism. Repeated attentional selection of the same internal content. But there's a second mechanism that strengthens it. When attention repeatedly engages self-referential or emotionally significant material, it increases the likelihood that related thoughts and sensations will become active again at a lower level of processing. In simpler terms, the system becomes more likely to generate similar material in the future. Not because it's creating it from nothing, but because repeated activation makes those pathways easier to re-engage. So now two things are happening at once. First, your attention is repeatedly selecting the same kind of internal content. Second, that repeated selection is increasing the probability that similar content will appear again. And this is where your experience starts to shift. It begins to feel like your mind is producing more of the same material. But from a cognitive standpoint, what's actually happening is reinforcement through repeated activation within the same internal network. Now, this also explains something important about suppression. When you try not to think about something, your system still has to monitor whether that thought is present. That means your attention has to reference it. So even the act of trying to suppress a thought keeps it active in the system. And because activation naturally fades unless it's refreshed, this repeated checking unintentionally maintains it. So the control strategy becomes part of the maintenance process. And at the same time, all of this is resource dependent. Your executive control is not unlimited. It has to allocate capacity, energy to monitoring, evaluating, and regulating your internal states. So as more of that capacity is used internally, less is available for external tasks. That's why your performance drops. Your focus on stable and even simple tasks take much more effort. So there's also another effect here, right? Under normal conditions, your attention can shift flexibly between external focus and internal processing. But when self-referential processing becomes sustained, that flexibility decreases. The system becomes biased towards continuing to monitor your internal content. So even when you try to move away from it, your attention tends to return. Not because it's forced, but because the system has become tuned to treat your internal signals as priority. And importantly, this whole sequence feels voluntary because from your perspective, you're trying to understand what's happening. You feel like you're actively solving the problem. But in cognitive terms, what's happening is that an executive control strategy has been engaged, and it continuously redirects your attention towards the internal evaluation. You don't have to direct awareness of how strongly this is shaping your lower level processing. So when a thought or sensation appears, your mind constructs an explanation for it. And that explanation is shaped by what your attention is currently prioritizing. That's why neutral bodily sensations, they can become emotionally significant. Not because the sensation has changed, but because your attention has shifted into a mode where internal signals are now being monitored and interpreted. So let's now step back and see the structure, right? Everything starts with one transition. Attention shifting from a task engagement to self-monitoring. That single shift determines what gets selected, how long it stays active, and what gets reinforced. So the key variable is not the content of your thought. It's the mode of your attention. Are you still engaged in the task? Or have you shifted into internal evaluation? Because once that shift happens, every attempt to solve the content tends to reinforce the same selection process that's maintaining it. So the practical change is not the content control, it's the control of selection. You redirect attention back to something external and structured, something you can actually do. And when internal events appear, you don't engage them further. You don't analyze them. You don't hold them in your working memory. From a cognitive perspective, this allows those activations to naturally decay instead of being maintained. And when that happens consistently, your system begins to reorganize, right? Less repeated activation means weaker reinforcement. Less internal maintenance means more available capacity for everything else out there. And your attention can become flexible again, right? Not because the thoughts were solved, but because they were no longer being repeatedly selected for and sustained by your attention. So if this breaks down, it helps you make sense of how your attention and self-regulation actually work in real time. You can support my channel by liking the video and subscribing. And if you want to see how this connects to the broader model we've been building across this series, attention, executive control, emotional regulation, I have a playlist, at least 10 videos. It's linked on the screen and in the description below. Please check it out. I'll see you later. Thanks.